Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the Next Generation Endpoint Security Market Sizing and Forecast 2016 through 2020. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Our featured speaker is David Monahan, Research Director of Security and Risk Management at Enterprise Management Associates. David's in-depth security experience, which spans over 20 years, has included organizing and managing physical and information security programs, including security network operations for organizations ranging from Fortune 100 companies to local government. And before I hand things over to David, I wanted today's audience to know that David will be concluding his presentation by answering your questions. You can log those at any time using the Q&A functionality located in the right-hand column of your screen. Also, today's event is being recorded, and you will receive a follow-up email from EMA tomorrow. It will include the on-demand playback. And as a thank you for registering and attending today's event, you're going to get the full report that David has just released, as well as the slide deck. So I hope you'll check that email out. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our featured speaker, David Monahan. David?
Thanks, Raleigh. I appreciate it. Welcome, everybody, to our webinar today. The first thing I'd like to do is thank our webinar sponsors, Cisco, Fidelis Cybersecurity, and Malwarebytes. They were very beneficial in getting this on the air for all of you to participate in. So, again, thank you very much to them. When we look at the initial numbers here, we get some pretty big numbers, which is, I think, unique to this particular market right now. Which 2,000% represents the largest growth of a single company in this area. Now, granted, it was a small company, but for a year's worth of growth, that's very large. In addition, the 124% represents the annual 2014 through to 2015. So it's 2015's growth over 2014. That, as a market, is pretty tremendous as well. I'm not aware of any other markets that are growing that fast right now. 56% is the number that we are relating to the 5-year estimate from 2016 to 2020 over that CAGR, compounded annual growth rate. Again, that's pretty large. Now, looking at the situation in the market, I do think a lot of these numbers are unique, and it'll be very interesting to watch to see how they continue over the next few years. We'll talk about the entrance into the marketplace. We'll talk about the participants and so forth. But I think it's worth noting that there is a huge amount of activity in this particular area with all of the context we've seen around data heists, thefts, break-ins, and so forth. It seems that the vast majority of those break-ins are coming through vulnerabilities at the endpoint and or identity extraction at the endpoint via malware and malicious links and so forth. So that's what brings us to the fervor around endpoint protection as one of the aspects of a security program. I think this is one of the areas that we all need to look at because they are the first line of loss or defense within the technology area. People are generally the first, right? If we can get them to not click on the links, great, and we will solve a lot of problems. But unfortunately, the attackers are getting smarter, and the people are trying to get through as much information as they possibly can to deal with their jobs. And so a perfect record there is going to be almost impossible. A couple of things that I wanted to bring out prior to going into the depth of the research is in another research project I did called Data-Driven Security Reloaded, I asked 207 U.S. participants chosen at random if they believe that prevention of APTs and ATAs are possible with the existing technology. Interestingly enough, there was an overwhelming yes in that, with 79% saying, yeah, we believe that there are prevention technologies available, and I thought that was very encouraging from this particular area of technology's perspective, right? Because it does focus on what a lot of these folks are trying to do, and we'll talk about the different areas of what they're trying to do as well. We also asked them whether or not we thought detection was possible. And we can see here that a few more, 4% more, 83% said, yeah, we think that detection is possible of APTs and ATAs with existing technology. For those of you who aren't familiar with those acronyms, APT is Advanced Persistent Threat, and ATA is Advanced Targeted Attack. But those are generally technology-driven attacks from some method or another. But it was good to see that people do believe that technology is out there. And I think that the technology does exist in the technology stacks and the solutions that we identified in this research. One of the things I think that's important to bring out is the qualifications for consideration. There are a lot of different solutions out there that do a lot of things, and we try to keep this as simple as possible. Right? What are the qualifications for consideration? One, we wanted to make sure that next generation means you're not relying upon signatures or pattern-based rules or things like that for enforcement or detection, so prevention or detection. We've seen a lot in the original antivirus, right? That's where we started. We had to know something was out there, and then we created a signature or a pattern or a rule to be able to identify it. And we found that though that absolutely helps, right? Antivirus has been around for 20 years. It's been doing a lot of good. But at the same time, it's not able to address, in many cases, these advanced threats. And so we need to go beyond that. Additionally, number two, it needs to be proactive. You have to have a capability to tell somebody at the other end, a management person, an system admin, a security admin, something like that, that there's something going on, right? We stopped something. Here's what's going on your endpoint. We're detecting something. Here's what's going on at your endpoint. If it's not proactive, then it's not really helping me from a reduced dwell time and reduced spread of infection nearly as much as it possibly could, right? Because it could sit there for a week until I draw my next report, or a month, or a quarter, or however often it is that I draw that report. It has to be centrally manageable and scalable. So from that perspective, there are a lot of other individual companies out there that are addressing things on the consumer front, but they don't address the enterprise need to be centrally managed. So from that perspective, that was a key aspect. If we're going to deploy this in any kind of significant, even an SMB, small business environment, up to especially enterprise, we have to have something that, as an administrative team, we can manage and scale to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of endpoints. Lastly, it needed to have granular policy-based controls. So there has to be an ability to create a differential within my environment between somebody else's environment, right? It can't all be set. I have to be able to tune this, tweak this, get it set up the way I want it. I may want different policies for my laptops versus BYOD devices versus my servers versus my special function devices, whatever it is, whatever the rules are for my environment. I have to be able to create these rule sets to manage these things separately based on my business need. So the capabilities that we looked at from a high-level perspective are three: prevention, detection, and response. Prevention simply has to stop the execution of malware. Now, there's multiple ways of doing that. Excuse me. Some organizations use whitelisting or other types of advanced application control. Some folks look at how processes are running in memory, what they're trying to do. They'll look at behaviors within the operation stack. There's multiple methodologies given the number of technology vendors that we're seeing here, right? Each one has a slightly different approach to it with a lot of proprietary technology behind it. In the detection space, we're not trying to stop the execution. We recognize that it happens. It happened at some point, and I'm going to tell you that it happened either, hopefully in minutes to seconds, but I'm going to tell you that it happened, and ultimately tell you that these are the hosts that have a problem, and you need to go do something about it. And then in response, this is where we get to a lot of the meat of the action as well. Whether it's prevention or detection, there has to be some kind of response capability. At a minimum, it's going to provide some sort of incident alerting and tracking. Hopefully, it will also provide some kind of isolation of the infected host. It may, from an advanced perspective, provide the capability to remove the malware. But ultimately, one of these four things has to happen, at least one of them, if not multiples of them, to be able to provide an effective response. Simply telling me that something happened is detection. It's not response. From there, I have to be able to go in and do something about it. And these vendors are all very good about varying levels of response of whatever they're focusing on to be able to help you move along in that workflow to be able to resolve that issue and keep this situation from getting worse. So in terms of the research itself, there was a lot of work that went in behind the scenes looking at the vendors who would participate. Now, there was no exclusionary attempt made here whatsoever. I recognize that I don't know everybody in the industry. No one was disinvited or uninvited or not invited intentionally. There are vendors that I've heard about since releasing the report that say, hey, we're involved in this space. How come we didn't get the opportunity? And I apologize to those vendors for not catching them in advance and not saying them, but now they're on the list. The next time we work the report to see where we are in the industry, we'll include those vendors as well. But the good news is I think we caught all of the major vendors, at least covering the United States, and I think all of these vendors have a foothold overseas as well. Now within that, you'll recognize quite a number of these names: Carbon Black, formerly known as Bit9, and Bit9 Carbon Black, Bromium, CrowdStrike, FireEye, Malwarebytes, SentinelOne. There's quite a few vendors there that everybody, I'm sure, recognizes, and I didn't mention them all. There were some vendors that determined they did not want to participate, and they were invited. I either didn't get responses or they didn't have time to apply the resource, whatever. And no harm against them, but we wanted to note that we did invite them as well. With those vendors, we hope they're able to participate next time. And in the model, I tried to accommodate for a little bit of variance in knowing that I didn't catch all the vendors, because there's always going to be one more that pops up here and there, and also applying as much research as I could around these particular participating vendors. Now, the other thing I think that's important is some of these vendors provide multiple solutions in different areas of security. I mean, Cisco Systems obviously provides more than just an endpoint protection solution. We're all aware of their networking and other security capabilities. The same thing with IBM and so forth. But from that perspective, trying to break out what their revenues were in particular areas can be kind of difficult. I work with them as much as possible to do that. Some of the vendors have policies around breaking down their revenues into specific detail around that. They tend to compartmentalize it around functional areas, and so we did the best we could in order to get to that final result. So again, I just wanted to put everything up front in terms of the analysis and how that was done. Another piece of data that I think is interesting to relate to this particular report from data-driven security are the deployments within the world, if you will. Or let me couch that as North American world, so within the environments. In that particular report, I asked about 18 categories of technology, and hey, do you have this in your environment? And I wanted to relate this to this particular report for a couple of reasons. One, you can see that antivirus won out as the top dog, if you will, in terms of deployment. But if you notice the number there, 61%, that's much lower than I would have expected for this particular report. But if you think about the deployment of antivirus over time, that reached upwards of 95% at its peak. So you can see here that it's a declining technology. Well, where's that money going? If you look down towards the bottom with the green arrow, low saturation, high customer value, you'll see ETDR, endpoint threat detection response. That's how we classified endpoint technology in this particular report at the time. This was produced last year. But notice that that's in the 32% range. If you combine those two numbers, 61 and 32, we get 93%. That's pretty close to what that market was at its peak. So we're seeing dollars being drawn away from antivirus and moved into ETDR or Next Generation Endpoint Security, as I'm couching here, because I think I'm looking a little broader. But we do see that kind of a shift in the market spend, and I think that's important to note. So part of where this money is coming from is the overall security budget, and part of that is coming from your replacement of antivirus. A lot of vendors are augmenting their a lot of customers, are augmenting their antivirus with some sort of next generation endpoint security tool, and others are replacing it. And we're seeing that replacement aspect growing, and we're seeing the vendors in that space, though they worked very well with antivirus to augment that. We're seeing them, pitch a little more on and work more towards the replacement of antivirus. A couple of things we're seeing is in various compliance type areas such as HIPAA and PCI. They're beginning to change the language so that they're looking for endpoint protection as opposed to using the term antivirus, which opens the door for these vendors to get in and expand their footprints with customers who are using traditional antivirus and potentially replace some of those dollars. With that, for example, SentinelOne has a couple of certifications that they're able to be replaced by replace antivirus. So does Carbon Black. They've also been certified to be able an antivirus replacement, and that's one of the things I brought out in the report. That I think this is going to come out as more and more vendors see this opportunity. They're going to push for those types of certifications to expand that footprint, and that's why when I show you the models of the growth rates, you'll see three different categories. There's the low, the middle, and the high estimates, because it really depends a lot on what happens here with that particular change in the marketplace. Perceived value of technology. This also came from the data-driven security report, but I thought it was, again, good to reference here. And you can see that the ETDR solutions came in at second place. They tied for second place with mean perceived value of technologies based on total cost of ownership. So, of course, as you get larger, the cost per endpoint goes down. But aside from that, we're we're seeing a lot of value here because they are doing more than antivirus. You see antivirus highlighted at the bottom. It did hit the bottom of the stack. So interestingly, it's the most deployed, and it's also the least satisfied, provides the least value. And with ETDR and NGES type systems, we really do want to get in there and find out what's going on in those endpoints, again, being the upfront and the first point of contact, if you will, from a technology perspective with the external world and the internet and so forth. So they're providing a high amount of value, which is why we're seeing a significant growth rate in that marketplace. What I wanted to point out here, it was in the report, is the market evolution curve. So I didn't come up with this. I'm using a model that's in standard business management techniques. But you can see here is a bell curve. And what we have is it's divided up into 4 segments: emerging, growth, mature, and declining. That's the blue line. The yellow line shows the total market that's available, and so 100% is the total market share that's available. The bell curve approximates that in the sense that over time with emerging markets, right, there's more market than there is share, or more share than there is market, I should say, because there's not a lot of deployment. As you reach that orange block, which I'll describe in a second, you get to that growth. Your incline increases, your growth rate increases, and you have a change in the technology base. We are right in what's called the chasm between emerging and growth markets, probably a little more towards the growth side at this point. And the chasm is noted as an area where you have a significant change in the approach, right? Market adoption increases, market awareness is high, there's a lot of value, there's usually quite a few technologies in the area, and then what you'll see between that chasm and the top where you start to hit a mature environment, you'll see some technologies will fall off to the side, marketing issues, funding issues, whatever. You'll see acquisitions and mergers, right? Larger companies, of course, acquiring the technologies to add to their portfolio. And you'll see some of the smaller parties combining their tool sets and their capabilities in order to maintain market share and compete with the larger companies that are adding to the portfolio. And so from there, you get to mature and declining markets. Antivirus is kind of really in that declining market space, somewhere in there, as we're seeing market share move from them to the next generation endpoint security folks. Something that's also very useful to note in this particular report is that before 2010, there were only 4 vendors that currently still exist that participated in the research. Okay. Since that point, you can see from 2010 to 2015, each year we've had new vendors enter the space, and an increasing number of vendors. So in 2010 we had 2, and in 2011 we had 3 more, 4 more, 5 more, 8 more. And so ultimately we're still seeing a significant increase in the number of vendors that are shooting up into this space, expanding their marketplace and so forth, which also tells us that we're not fully in the growth stage. We're still in that emerging stage. We're right in that chasm area. But that's a huge number of vendors to emerge over the last 5 years from the time the research started. When we look at that, right, we get 77% of the vendors are 5 years or older, and 23% are 5 years or older, or 5 years old or newer. Excuse me. And so, in terms of technology, even in growth areas, that's a huge percentage to have in the new area versus the old area. And I'm using air quotes here, which you can't see. And I thought that was very interesting. So from that perspective, a lot of competition going on, a lot of market and media attention, and in some cases hype around that. And it's very difficult, as consumers, to wade through that and get to the point where you understand what's going on, what the differences are between the vendors. In fact, that's one of the things that I struggle with as an analyst, right? You start to listen to the vendors, and you really have to dig in because the marketing messages begin to sound very similar, especially at the high level, right? And so digging in to understand how they provide their technology, what the user interfaces are, what the management capabilities and interfaces are, how they approach prevention, how they approach detection, and so forth. These are all important aspects that take a good amount of time when you're trying to get to that core solution. We measured the market aspects of these vendors in two different ways. The first was the largest single deployment. We wanted to understand who was out in the marketplace, what what they had in terms of deployment and so forth. And so you can see here the rankings from top to bottom of the participating vendors, and we know that the ties here are within 10,000 users. Now, the data we got here are from the vendors, right? And I trust that the vendors all provided good data to me. They all wanted a good outcome. And by the way, I don't think I said this earlier, but I really do appreciate the openness that I got from all of the vendors in this space in providing their information. That was very helpful in trying to get to this. And even if they didn't come out on top or didn't think they were going to come out on top, vendors were very helpful in providing as much information as was allowable under their corporate policies or whatever financial state they're in. So absolutely appreciate that. But you can see here, now the really interesting thing in this also is the fact that, I can't share specific numbers, but I can tell you that the top vendors here were in hundreds of thousands of seats in a single deployment. That to me was really a testimony to how well these particular vendors scale. If they have hundreds of thousands that are out there operating in a single deployment, you know that particular team has to have a very good capability to manage that, because they're not going to be able to. That even in your large financial corporations that have 100 or more people in their security team, when you're talking 1,000 to 1 endpoints, that's a lot of endpoints to manage. So they have to have strong ability to manage and maintain those particular solutions in the environment. Even below number 5, all of those organizations had multiple tens of thousands in their deployment list, showing that they had good solutions that could scale to at least reasonably well, scales beyond what most organizations are going to need. If we look at the top ranked by market share licenses sold, right, we can see that Carbon Black came up first, with Cisco running a fairly close second, and Fidelis, tying with them as well. And then it goes around the circle of Vecto, Cylance, and Vincia, so forth. Each one of these vendors has a different approach to their solutions, so I thought that was very good as well. Congratulations to Carbon Black from that perspective, and also from Cisco and Fidelis's perspective. Congratulations to them as well. I think what we're going to talk about the by market share by revenue in just a minute, but I think on this one, Cisco acquired their solution, Fidelis acquired at least part of their solution as well, and so forth. So I think these vendors have done a great job in taking these solutions and getting them expanded off the ground and making them effective solutions in their environment. And each one of the vendors here has a slightly different plan on how to integrate with your infrastructure environment and use management tools to be able to deliver their solution. So that's another aspect that you'll want to look at as well. With the vendor ranked by licenses sold, we have this is incorrect, because licenses sold. I apologize. I didn't realize I'd gone through this, but this. This is single. I apologize. Okay, so this is license sold. I'm starting to lose my mind here. I apologize. So by licenses sold, you can see here with Carbon Black just showing the rankings as compared to the market shares. It's the same information, just presented in a ranking form rather than a percentage form. I apologize for the confusion. Now we have the revenue by market share. That's what I was expecting to come up next. That's why I confused myself. I apologize. So with this, you can see Carbon Black came up in the lead again, Cisco coming up as second. In this case, though, Bromium came up as third, and Malware tied for third with them, Malwarebytes. Malwarebytes has been a solution for the consumer side for a number of years, and I know that I use it myself. In the IT environment and security, trying to rid myself of something that my common antivirus did not do. And so I respected them from a solution perspective there. They've now come out with an enterprise solution, centralized management, and so forth that met the criteria. So they were included in the research and did a great stand-up there from the market perspective. Very surprising. They do have a huge following in the consumer section, but they're actually growing very well in the commercial enterprise sector as well. So these particular vendors doing very well, and you can see CrowdStrike and Vincia gaining ground, doing well in that particular space as well, and then the others combined finished up the rest of the market survey. Somehow we got a double strike there. Come on, there we go. All right, there we go. So here we have the aggregate ranking. What I did on this particular slide is took the same information and put it into a chart form as well. So you can see Carbon Black number 1, Cisco number 2, Malwarebytes, and coming in number 3. Now, with this particular chart, what I did is combined the market share by revenue and the market share by licenses sold to come up with that number. And the reason I did that is because I think each one of those two has their strengths. A vendor can give away licenses, right? You can give away license for free to gain market share by license. You can lower the price to try and gain more market share and revenue at the same time, right? So each one of those has their benefits, right? And I have no shame in saying, the crack model, which is give it away for free, right, and then begin to charge for it, that has worked very well in the IT industry, whether that's tools by Microsoft, whether that's tools by endpoint companies, et cetera. And I don't know who's done which, but my point is that you can give it away, right, to gain market share, attention, visibility, and then you begin to charge for it. And the other aspect, again, is you go in for the loss leader. You give it away very low price at first, either combined in bundles or whatever the aspect is, to gain market share while attributing revenue, right? So I think both of those have their benefits. So combine those, you see how they fell out with the information that we were able to extrapolate or to gather. So not a lot of change in the footprint overall, but I think these are very useful to know. Market value. So for those of you who are interested in the dollar signs, the estimated value of the market within the NGES range was about $426 million, so almost $500 million in the mid-range. And I highlighted the mid-range here. I'm going to go with that. Low-range estimate, high-range estimate, so there's a pretty good sway in there. But I think the mid-range is probably most accurate, given what I could either discern, determine, or collect. Given that, the overall market value for endpoint is anywhere between $4 billion and $9 billion, depending upon what you include in that. And some will include antivirus, endpoint firewalls, and then they begin to expand out there with HIDs and other things. So in the report, I go through the different ranges and what they represent from the total markets that can be compared against. So this is about a tenth of the endpoint antivirus market and those types of things currently. So there's a lot of room to grow, which is great news for these folks because there's a lot of them competing for the market share. And as you continue to move along, I have a conservative estimate and an aggressive estimate. The difference in the two ultimately comes back to what we think will happen in the future with either market aggregation, changes in technology, acquisitions and mergers, and so forth. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, with the change in compliance statutes and what the verbiage say, and whether or not vendors are able to acquire additional certifications or accreditations around replacement for antivirus. If you get that happening along with not a significant acquisition or merger to a large company, you'll end up in the aggressive range. If you have less of that, or you have more aggressive acquisitions, you may see less of that in the conservative range. But I think that it's good to note there that by 2020 we're going to be somewhere between $2.75 billion and let's say $3.5 billion on the mid-range estimate. And I think those are good numbers to go by, again, depending upon what happens with the changes in the environment. So going forward, what do we see? I mentioned, I think we need to have the companies further push their acceptance by regulators and auditors to have compliance information updated, right, to accept any endpoint protection solution. It doesn't have to be specifically antivirus. Getting the further third-party certifications also important. That's going to be a significant market changer within this because, as I mentioned earlier, right now the main pitch for these companies is to come in and augment antivirus. And it's mainly so they can get in the door and get some attention from the folks that already believe they have antivirus, right? For those people who don't recognize the difference in the technology and the difference in the capabilities. But as they get that, the organizations that are required to have antivirus by their compliance requirements can then branch out and either change that money into some other aspect of technology while converting over to the Next Generation Endpoint Security, or they can drop it altogether. They can go to free antivirus. There's plenty of opportunities here. I think one of the things we're going to have to see over the next few years is you're going to see a few of these companies either merge together, right, to continue gathering market share, You're going to see potentially some acquisitions. I think that may happen. In terms of the acquisitions, I don't have any better crystal ball than anybody else, I think, overall. But my perception on this is, the larger antivirus companies that talk about that they have next generation endpoint solutions that address persistent malware and other types of APTs and ATAs, they're not making a lot of headway in that. So what you'll probably see is some acquisition of one of these smaller companies when they get to sufficient size to be a threat. Right now, except for the larger vendors that we talked about with IBM, Cisco, so forth, I don't think any of these guys, and Carbon Black, I don't think any of them necessarily have enough market share to be a threat to those companies. And even Carbon Black as the market leader, at less than $100 million currently, right around $100 million, probably coming up this coming year is my guess. They're not quite right for an acquisition. I don't know if they'll be acquired or not. I don't know if any of these companies will for sure, but I have to say I think that when they get to that size, there'll be enough of a threat that one of the larger companies may look at acquiring their technology to add to their portfolio to get market attention and market cred. I think right now that even if they do have solutions that work in that area, folks tend to mentally fixate on their antivirus legacy, and they don't look at them as a next generation solution, and ultimately causes them not to be considered a solution in a lot of those areas. Let's see. So additionally, I think I've talked about acquisitions and so forth. So yeah, I think I've hit all of those. And then the last thing that could happen is some of these companies could decide to go into the consumer segment and expand there. Malwarebytes, for example, and Komodo, they've kind of gone the reverse. They started out more in that consumer realm and have moved into the commercial segment. Whereas these other companies are focusing on the commercial and enterprise segment, and they may want to move into that. They can go talk to the Komodos and the Malwarebytes and Avast and so forth, and they'll note that that's a big headache, right? So instead of dealing with one help desk and one person that manages thousands of desktops, you're dealing with one person that manages one desktop. So the scale is totally different. The approach is different. You're dealing with folks that aren't technically adept in many cases, right? And so your time spent per call and per customer is much higher. So at this point, most of those companies are not ready to do that. They don't have the size and scale to be able to address that from a revenue perspective. So they could decide to go that route, but that could be a headache as well. Additionally, one thing I don't have mentioned here, which could affect that, is adoption by managed service providers. A number of these companies have deals with various managed security services and other managed service providers, hardware vendors, and so forth, to distribute free copies of their solution or managed copies of their solution, and then the managed service provider is managing on the backside. If the companies that currently exist that don't have those go out that route and begin to compete in that area, then that can also significantly expand their revenue potential and footprint in the area. So at this point, I'm done with the content I had. That gives us about 10 minutes for Q&A. I've seen some things popping up. So Raleigh, I'll hand it off back to you, and we can get started with some questions.
Great. Thank you, David. The first question that came in is Next Gen Endpoint Security / Protection considered an acceptable replacement for AV that would satisfy compliance and contractual agreements? If not, when do you see this as being an acceptable replacement?
So it depends on your compliance requirement. The PCI 3.0, and I think that the 3.1 is coming out shortly. I may be one version behind. I have to keep up with all these things. They've changed their nomenclature within that particular requirement, so it doesn't specify AV, and that's where the folks that have that certification I mentioned earlier, like your SentinelOnes and your Carbon Blacks, have a potential advantage because they've been certified by external entities to be a replacement for AV. Now, any of the HIPAA also is changing and updating their information, I believe, as well. I'm not as familiar with the updates on that one, though. Now, with that, any of these solutions could be a replacement for AV in the sense that they will all provide at least detection, if not prevention, of an advanced malware attack. So I think from the base point of your question is, the first one, it does depend on the compliance regulation you're under and what that state specifically, and then two, what the auditors will accept, right? If you can convince your auditor that it's an acceptable replacement or they believe it is, then you can use it. I think from a technology perspective, any of these solutions is a step up from a traditional antivirus and could easily replace that particular those particular solutions from an advanced perspective. So I think that answers the whole question. If not, you can submit something else and we'll try and get back to it. But I think that answers your question. Depends on which one you have, but ultimately from a technology perspective, they're adequate to do what you need to do. Any more questions?
Thanks for that. Yeah, there are. The next question that came in is, what will be the effect of MDM and EMM solutions from the large platform providers on endpoint protection?
What will be the effect of MDM and EMM solutions? I'm not quite sure I understand the question. So from the next generation endpoint, most of these solutions are geared around let me take that back. So in the report, in the end of it, each profile tells you what operating systems the vendors support, and I don't remember the percentage off the top of my head. That's why I retracted my most statement. But many of these vendors will support Windows 10 across multiple devices, right? Because Windows 10 is a standard operating system across tablet, mobile, desktop, server, etc. Many of them also support Linux as well, and then beyond that, when we're talking about iOS, there are some that support iOS devices. More will support Mac OS devices. So I'm not quite sure how to answer the question, but it is possible for the MDM and EMM solutions to integrate these into their solution. And some of them have apps available for their for mobile devices you can download and check. But I don't know if those are free or paid solutions. I don't recall off the top of my head. I didn't really dig into the mobile apps all that. I hope that answers your question. Again, if there's more, feel free to submit details, and I'll try to drill down where you're needed.
Great. Thank you, David. Another question is, which do you think is better, prevention or detection?
So that's always that really is, and for lack of a better term, it is a jihad. It is a holy war. People seem to be very polarized on both sides. Personally, I think that prevention is a great way, and I think that detection is a great way. If you had to ask me, I like prevention because I feel that even if given the fact that we know prevention solutions are not going to be 100% always and forever, someone's going to come up with a way to get around them. Just like with antivirus, I'd rather know 90%, 95, 80, 70% of the bad things are stopped if it's able to alert me on the other things, right? If it's not, then now we're back to do I need to augment that with an additional detection solution, or do I just go with a detection solution? Personally, I think that if you can provide prevention up front and not have to do the work of remediation because you prevented it, that's going to save you man hours. And the more seats you have and the more exposure you have to the internet, the bigger that cost savings is going to be. However, detection vendors do go a step above that of prevention if the prevention vendors fail. Now, the thing you have to look out for on the detection side is false positives and false, that type of false alerts. Depending upon the solution, the environment, how it's configured, you may get more false positives, which drive work as well. So I think both solutions are very valid. It depends on, in your environment, what you have the dollars for and what is supported within your golden image, if you will. Some prevention solutions may not play well in your golden image. They all do a lot of work to try and make it work with everything, but there's inevitably something that comes up that may cause some problems here and there. Detection may be more what you need. So I hope that answers your question, right? But I think that both are valid. I particularly like prevention up front to try and stop the bulk of the attacks. If you find that prevention is not able to tell you about other things that are going on, you may need to look at another solution for your environment.
Thanks, David. Let's take one more question. It is, if the traditional AV companies were staying cutting edge, this market would not exist. At what point do you think they will begin to deal with this market?
Well, I think that comes back to my earlier comment. So I agree with you in that, if antivirus was perfect, none of these solutions or very few of them would exist, right? Because the market would already be done, the big companies would own it, and it would all be good. Because there are things that are getting by their technologies, new vendors have come into play to fill the gap. As I mentioned a little earlier, I think what will happen is you'll see some of these companies begin to amass more dollars. I'll take a stab in the ground and say, let's say $100 million is the mark. If they're already earning billions, $100 million is a drop in the bucket to them. And so from a purchase perspective, they're going to pay 2, 3, 4x the market cap at the most. So depending upon what their market cap is, they'll buy the company, integrate their technology, and then they'll have both name recognition and they'll have additional capabilities. The key will come is if they're able to integrate tech technology into their stack, which of course they should investigate. Before they go to make a purchase. If they do that, then it'll probably take them another year or to let's say 2 at the max to realize that expense and be able to integrate it. What we've seen in the past in technologies is you'll see the big companies partner with the small companies. They'll get the integrations going as a partner aspect, and then suddenly they're sucked up, right? It's not a big surprise when that happens. So that's more than likely what we'll see in that. So watch out for these technology partnerships, technology alignments with the big antivirus companies and some of these smaller companies, and then you might begin to see some acquisitions over the course of a year or two after that particular alignment, because that'll give them time to integrate the technology sufficiently so they can ultimately spend another few months and get an integrated agent or whatever they need. Hope that answers your question. Any other questions?
We are almost out of time. If you had a question that was not answered, I will go ahead and send that on to David. I wanted to thank everyone again for joining us. Your attendance is what enables us to continue to hold these events. And as a thank you, all of you attendees are going to receive this full report as well as a PDF of today's slides. So be on the lookout for that email from EMA tomorrow. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.